when I made this book, I didn't think of it as something that would be difficult to read at all. And I imagine everybody who writes something difficult feels that way before when they send it out into the world. So the book is somewhat confusing because it has a three-dimensional aspect. You can see literally into the book. I guess I should describe what the book is first. About maybe 3 years ago, I got an email from someone I'd never heard of before saying, I'm starting a new publishing house, a kind of art, literary publishing house, and would you like to make a book? And I can't promise you, and there's a long list of things she couldn't promise. I can't promise you lots of sales. I can't promise you an advance. I can't promise you this and that and that. But what I can promise you is that we'll make any book you want to make. And we'll make it as beautifully as it could be made. And it's not that I was bowled over by that so much as I didn't believe it. And I thought, well, she probably doesn't really know what she's saying. Maybe she thought I would want to, I don't know, doodle in a book or something, but to say we can make any book you want to make. And so I started thinking, what are the limits of a book I would want to make? Not because they were the limits of what a book could be, but because they were the limits of what I wanted. And I had for a long time been interested in a process called die cutting, which is an ancient, I don't know if it's ancient, but it's very, very old. It's been used as long as there's been manufacturing of pretty much any kind. And it's basically taking a material out of a material with a stamp, pushing something through a material. So your car door is made by die cutting a piece of steel or whatever.
It's a tough word, die cutting.
Die cutting.
When I saw it the first time, I thought, wow, die hard cutting.
It's almost onomatopoeic. Yeah. It's not because it doesn't make that sound when it's done, but it sounds, it's almost like a Yiddish word. It sounds like what it is. Yeah. In any case, I had wanted to do something with paper, with die cutting. And so I asked her if that would be possible, and she said yes. And so we entered into this process that ended up taking a couple of years. And I started with one of my favorite books, which is Bruno Schulz's Street of Crocodiles, and tried to carve out of it another story. And I did.
How do you choose words from a text that you love as much as you love the text by Bruno Schulz?
Well, in a way, loving the text didn't have anything to do with it. I love the text because it was so, almost exactly because it's so good for this purpose. It's just so, if you were going to eat a food that you loved, you would prefer that the plate be overflowing with it rather than that there be a tiny little bit in the center of the plate. I would anyway. That's probably a very American thing I just said. But his book is overflowing with things that I love. And so when I had to choose the book to commit to a book to use this process with, I wanted a very rich palette. If you're a painter, you don't want a palette with two colors. Well, you might, but you would rather have the choice of as many colors as there are. And I think his book offers as many colors as any book that there is. When I was working on it, I didn't feel any reverence for the book. I didn't feel any sensitivity to changing it because I wasn't changing the book. In the visual arts, if you use another piece of art as a starting point, you're almost always changing it permanently. The most famous example is Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning, where he took a de Kooning drawing and erased it, and then there's no more de Kooning drawing. But of course, I made the book, and yet it's still possible to go buy Street of Crocodiles. It's not like I did it literally to every copy of the Street of Crocodiles that exists. So I wasn't worried about that at all. I was a little nervous about some of the historical resonance, because Bruno Schulz was killed during the war, and in fact had a lost book, a masterpiece supposedly, that has never been seen since. And there are the books that he didn't write that he presumably would have. And there is something that you could either see as really interesting and rich about that resonance, or just kind of unfortunate and awkward. I prefer to think of it the first way, but I did go back and forth while I was working on the book.
But can you just, for the people who haven't read Bruno Schulz, could you just give a short resume of what his story is as compared to the story that you made out of his story?
His book is really not best served by describing the story. In the same way that it would be like if somebody said, "Tell me about this person you're in love with," and you said, you gave the genetic code. It's true, and it's maybe even more true than any other description, but it doesn't have anything much to do with why you would feel that way about
But they
something.
may want to read it when you've just given the genetic code, and they can do the beautiful work themselves.
I'll tell you what I like about it. How about that? It's very much a story about a father and a son, a family. And it is told with a kind of emotions aren't conveyed as they usually are, which is through the kind of cause and effects of what people do to one another. The emotions are conveyed by generating this kind of sublime experience. You don't read the book. The nicest thing anybody ever said about anything I've ever written was one of the first people who ever read my first book. And she said, I cried most at the parts that weren't sad.
Yeah.
And that is what the kind of writing that I aspire to write, and it's what Bruno Schulz does. It is absolutely transporting, and it's absolutely affecting, but not because it's, strumming at your chords, not because it's attempting to manipulate your emotions or even really generate any feeling. It's just so, it like pushes against nature. It really makes you feel, there's a really wonderful book I finished not long ago called Man is Not Alone by Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he talks about religious experiences. And he says it's possible to scoff at almost anything if you want to. You can scoff at Picasso, you can scoff at Beethoven, you can scoff at any country, you can scoff at any political event. But he said nobody can scoff at the ocean at night. Nobody can stand facing the ocean and scoff, and nobody can look at the night sky and scoff.
What exactly does the word scoff mean?
Oh, scoff, that's a hard one. It's basically to dismiss, but with like a gesture of dismissal. And I think what Bruno Schulz is doing is something nobody could scoff at. You could dislike it, you could say it's not for me, you could not understand it, as I often don't understand it. But you can't scoff at it because you know that he is pushing against something that's fundamentally true, not about how fathers and sons relate, because again, it's not really about plot, it's not about what people do to each other, it's this atmosphere that's generated. So that's the best pitch I can make for that book. It's a really wonderful book.
It's beyond plot.
It's beyond plot. I only read the book by accident, actually. When I was in high school, all of my life I've been very, very close to my older brother, and my younger brother as well. But in case he's here. But I was very close with my older brother, and my father and mother, for that matter.
Actually, the whole family can be,
All of.
You have a family thing. We'll get back to that.
I was very close to my older brother, and I was it was the summer after my sophomore year of high school, and he was getting ready to go off to college to New York. We lived in Washington, and I was really grieving. I was mourning over this prospect, and I would sit in his room and watch him pack and talk to him, and he had a milk carton that he kept in the corner of the room where he would put books that he wanted to have with him. So he didn't have any course load yet. He hadn't even, to my knowledge, picked his what he was going to study. So these were only books that he felt like he couldn't not have with him. And Street of Crocodiles happened to be on the top of this stack, and I'd never seen it before, I'd never heard of it. And I thought, well, it must be something pretty special if he wants to take it. So I took it back to my room and I read it. And it actually didn't make any particularly strong impression on me at the time, because it is a difficult book, and maybe I wasn't quite ready for it.
How old were you?
I was 16. And then I read it again when I was in college, and it did make a very strong impression on me. By the way, this is the same copy that never went to New York, which I still have. And then when I started thinking about this book and thinking about what might be the material that I took material from, and I started thinking about, what I might find. If you're a paleontologist, you have the choice to go dig in the sand You have the choice to go dig in the snow. You have the choice to, dig in a tree if you want. But you know that it's more likely you're going to find certain things when you dig in certain places. And I thought maybe I would try it with the dictionary. Maybe that would be really interesting and sort of deep. But it wouldn't have been either, actually. And I thought maybe I would try to write something that I would remove material from. But then I didn't like that idea either. And then I just started thinking about this book and my history with the book. And when I reread it, it felt completely obvious.
Will you read a bit now?
I can read a little bit. It's not...
I'm so curious to see how you're going to read it.
It's a little like asking a dancer to dance a little bit without dancing.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't really make sense without the whole kit and caboodle. Okay, I'm just going to read the very beginning. The passers-by had their eyes half closed. Everyone wore his mask. The children greeted each other with masks painted on their faces. They smiled at each other's smiles. Growing in this emptiness, wanting to resemble the reflections, whole generations had fallen asleep. By the way, at this pace, I could read the whole book in about 5 minutes. Apart from them, Mother and I ambled, guiding our shadows over a keyboard of paving stones. We passed the chemist's large jar of pain. We passed houses, sinking, windows and all, into their gardens. Overlooked beyond the margin of time an endless day, an enormous last day of life. The sleeping garden screamed. The garden turned in its sleep, its back rising and falling as it breathed. August had expanded into enormous tongues of greenery. August painted the air with a mop. That's that's enough.
Okay. I just want to know for my own mental health, it was never an option to read like this and try to make a total blah, 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 just words.
To read it straight through? No, because I couldn't, one could do that. One could also not...
One did that for a while.
It's not what I intended, I can say that. It's also, that's something I would have had no control over. And sometimes it's really interesting to have no control over anything. But I wouldn't be interested in an entire book that I had no control over. To me, the whole point of making things is the marriage of control and lack of control. I'm not interested in making something that I have complete control over, and I'm not interested in making something that I have no control over. Each project is finding a kind of balance where you at once... it's like steering a car with your knees. Like, it's one way to move around. And there's a great saying, Joseph Brodsky said the rhyme is smarter than the poet. And I think what he meant is people write in verse not only because it can be very appealing, very attractive to the sound of it, the rhythm of it, but also because when you put yourself in a position of needing to form a thought around that problem of a word rhyming with the word above it or a word near it, you're not free anymore. You're constrained by the problem, and the solutions to the problem are often a lot more interesting than what you would have done if you hadn't had a problem. Necessity is the mother of invention. So what is the right amount of necessity when you're making something? That I give a lot of thought to that. But it would have been too much necessity. Just simply looking through it, having no control over what the relationship between a word on page 1 and a word much deeper into the book would have been.
But reading it like that just means that there are some words you see it many times. Mother, father, scream, for instance.
With the exception of Scream, that's true of almost every book that's ever been written. But I was, in a way, the story that I told wasn't like the story that Bruno Schulz told, but there were things that I couldn't escape. Like, I couldn't escape a very strong father figure. And I didn't want to either. It felt like a way of being faithful to the referent book without being dependent on it.
But when you had me going like that, perhaps it was also because Tree of Codes is an extract of the original title of Bruno Schulz's book. And Tree of Codes, there is something in every book of yours which is a search for codes. Is that, do you have a detective-like need to write as answers to questions that you pose yourself?
Not really. I mean, codes aren't actually something I'm very interested in, but I apparently am very interested in searching. That's the funny thing about writing, and in a way, the very best thing about writing is that you come to see what you're interested in, because you walk through life thinking you're interested in all sorts of things, but in fact, they're just things you think you should be interested in, or you want to be the kind of person who is interested in. And then you write books, and you're confronted with not necessarily a more accurate self-portrait, but a different one. So in my life, maybe the best example is Judaism. Before I wrote, I am still not a religious person by most anyone's definition of religious, and I wasn't overly interested. I didn't think I was overly interested in my identity as a Jew or questions of Jewish thought or Jewish history. And yet then I started writing, and I remember at a certain point looking at, when I'd had, let's say, 200 pages of my first book, looking at it, I thought, man, this is Jewish. This is really Jewish. And it was like that moment in a trial when the prosecutor says, well, we've been listening to the defendant for the last 3 weeks tell us that he didn't kill the victim, and then he takes the bloody glove out and says, it's his blood, and it's her blood, so draw your own conclusions. When I read my first book, it was like a bloody glove. I was just like, I'd been saying this thing to myself and probably to others, and yet then I had this artifact of my, whatever you call it, my subconscious or my imagination, and left to draw my own conclusions. I would have to say that these things I was interested in them, that they meant a lot to me. And so moving deeper into, you can write your first book pretty much by accident, and you can write your second book in response to your first book. But then after that, you start to really leave a trail. And it's been interesting to me, the things that I seem not to be able to get away from. And just as I was saying earlier, that writing has become this balance of control and lack of control, it's also become a balance of what I want to escape and what I want to stop resisting. And I don't know exactly what I feel. I mean, it's a question I ask myself constantly. Do I really want to do this again?
You mean right?
Well, that's another question I ask, but no, I mean, do I want to go at this subject matter again? Do I want to write about a search again? Do I really want to write about Judaism again? Do I really want to do this again? Trauma, that's another thing that I seem to be really drawn to like a magnet. And the answer isn't to go with the flow. That's stupid. But it's equally stupid to resist the flow. So it's navigating the flow is what I've been struggling with.